So this story begins about a year ago. I boarded a plane to Spain, to Alicante, and I got sat next to an older gentleman. He was in the window seat, I was in the middle seat, and the minute that we sat down, we started talking. And the conversation just flowed. Do you know, like when you're talking to an old friend, it just flowed perfectly. And it continued to flow as we took that flight, about 2¾ hour flight. And he was telling me about how earlier in his life, when he left school, he was very passionate about sports, and then he got selected for the local football team to represent his town. And from there, in his mid-20s, he went on to a much bigger team. And, I guess he was a professional footballer at that time. And then injury struck, and he had to rethink his career choices. And so, keeping within the same theme of sports, he went and studied to be a PE teacher, a physical education teacher, and he absolutely loved inspiring young people to take up sports. And he did that for all of his adult life. And we talked about our many journeys, the ups and downs of life. I mean, it was a 2¾ hour flight, and we did talk the entire flight. In fact, we stopped talking when the plane landed in Spain. And at the end of the conversation, as we were just pulling up to disembark, I said to him, "So, you must have retired some time ago then?" And he says, "Yeah, about 9 years ago, when I was 71. And I just looked at him and I went, "You're 80? And he says, "Yeah." And I said, "You're 80 and you've been telling me that you're running keep fit classes for the over 50s, that you encourage people to get exercise, and you're 80. I said, "You're an absolute inspiration." And I said, "You have taught me a lot about really what to focus on as we get older." And he thought nothing of it. He said, "Oh, it's what I do. I love sport, I love reading, and yeah, I do what I do. I get out and get lots of exercise. I like to watch, the odd band. I don't do anything to excess." And I said, "Well, I'm going to take that from our meeting, and I'm going to apply that to my life." And we shook hands. I said to him, "You're an inspiration." And he said to me, "Well, you're a very interesting man." And we both laughed, and off we went. And then a couple of weeks ago, on my birthday, on the 7th of February, I went to Whitby because I decided to go on a little solo hiking trip, take myself away for a few days and to walk part of the Cleveland Way. And so I arrived in Whitby on the Saturday sort of early afternoon, and parked in the main car park near the marina. And I thought, well, I would do a short walk that day from the car park along the river to a small village called Russup. You pronounce it Russup, but it's actually spelled Russ-Warp. I could never understand that. And the reason why I wanted to do that was because as a child, when I remember I was about 13, that kind of age, my mum and dad would choose holiday destinations where I could enjoy some fishing and they could disappear for the day and go and visit the towns and get in the car and go places. And that was perfect for me as well. I mean, I was very lucky to have parents that were so obliging like that. So we went to Russup one year when I was about 13, and I wanted to revisit it because I wanted to see how much it had changed. I mean, I'd driven through it since, but I just wanted to walk through the village and see how it had changed. And so before I set off on that walk, I thought, do you know what? I'm going to pop up into the main town in Whitby from the car park, only a few hundred metres, and I'm going to get myself a little snack because I couldn't really remember how far the walk was. And I thought I better have a little snack and I better use the public toilets. 50 pence they charged for the public toilets, but they were very clean. And so I went into the Co-op, the supermarket there, big store, and I thought, well, I'll get myself a Scotch egg. Now, anybody who doesn't know what a Scotch egg is a hard-boiled egg covered in sausage meat and baked. And, I mean, it's all protein, so it's great for a walk. So I walked into the co-op and I went and found the Scotch eggs on the aisle, and I was walking back to the checkout, and I like to use the checkouts that are kind of human operated and not the automatic ones, because I think, well, it's keeping people in employment, and also I enjoy that interaction, the human interaction. And as I was walking up to that checkout, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be amazing if I bumped into that old gentleman again? I won't mention his name here, but wouldn't it be amazing if I bumped into that old gentleman again that I chatted with like a year ago on the aeroplane, because I knew he lived in Whitby. Bearing in mind, over 13,000 people live in Whitby, and it was an events weekend. I think it was a steampunk weekend. So there was a lot of people there. And as I walked up to the checkout, who was there next in line? But that gentleman. And I just looked at him and smiled. And I said, "How are you doing?" And he looked at me and he didn't recognise me. And so I mentioned his name and I said, "The flight last year to Spain." And his eyes lit up and he said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Not very well." I said, "I'm sorry to hear about that. What's happened?" And he said, "I don't want to talk about it." And you could feel the mood really drop in that moment. And so I changed the subject and I said, "What chance is it of bumping into you here? All these people who live here and bumping into you. That's just amazing." And he said, "It is, isn't it?" And then I explained that I was going to do part of the Cleveland Way as well, and also walk through a heavily wooded area where there was a castle too. And so we carried on talking, and then he started to tell me what had happened. When he got back from Spain, he had a bit of a cough, and it was just an irritating cough, but he thought, I better get it checked out. And so he went to the doctors, and the doctor had him rushed to hospital, said that he had a heart problem and that he wasn't processing. I think what he said was that he was only getting about 20% of the oxygen that he should be getting, and that he was going to have to definitely change his lifestyle. And he found that he was out of breath easily, and he'd explained that he'd had to stop doing the keep fit for the over 50s, and he wasn't getting as much exercise or the walks that he would normally do. You know, and you could see there was a real sadness in his eyes. Here's a man who's been active all of his life, and really it'd been cut short. And then he explained that he'd also developed really bad rheumatism. And he said, "I just don't have the quality of life that I used to have." And then he said, "I often look at those pills and think, I might as well just take them all, because I don't want to be here." And I didn't respond straight away. I just paused and I said, "Well, that's a normal thing to think, isn't it? You know, when we get caught up in, you know, in our moods of how we're feeling about ourselves." And I said, "But there's going to be some days where you feel, obviously, better than that." And he said, "Oh, yeah." And I asked him, "What do you enjoy doing?" And he said, "Oh, I love reading and I love watching sport, so I get to do that, so I'm really grateful for that." And he said, "But I do find myself waking up planning to do things that I know I'm not capable of doing, and then feeling really disappointed with myself." So I said to him, "Well, maybe focusing on the things that you can do would be more helpful for you." And he agreed. And I said to him, some of that come up in my village hall wellbeing class that week was all about appreciation of what we can do, and having gratitude for the things that we can do as well. And that can be really powerful in lifting our moods. Anyway, I explained to him that I was going out for dinner that night to a lovely fish restaurant, and I invited him to join me on my birthday, my treat. But he declined because he'd got a ready meal. I think he'd got sweet and sour pork in a ready meal in his hands. And he said, "I'm not really feeling like being good company." So I said, "I respect that." And we both paid for our food, and we shook hands, and we said our goodbyes. I will probably never see him again, but what's the chance of bumping into somebody who I felt had a really big impact on my life? Now, some people watching this might be thinking, well, why didn't you get his number? And you know what? It didn't feel necessary. It really didn't. Anyway, I did my walk. I went to Russup. I walked along the river, and it brought back so many memories. And yeah, I remember when I walked onto the bridge, I remembered being on the bridge one day and a young lad who lived opposite, right on the banks of the river, his parents had a house there. A young lad had come across and he'd sat with me while I was fishing, and he asked me if I wanted to have a go in his dinghy in the weir pool. And I said, yeah, are we allowed? And he went, yeah, of course we are. He was quite cheeky, and he was a ginger-haired lad, and he was very confident. And the next day I met him in the morning, and we went in his dinghy, and we rowed right up close to the weir. And he said, let's go in the mill race. So the mill race is basically an archway underneath the mill where all the water comes out after it's been through the mill. But it was disused. And he said, there's some big fish in there. So I was intrigued. So off we went the next morning, got in his little dinghy, little yellow dinghy, and paddled into the actual mill race. Well, as we went under it, it was really, really dark. We had to duck our heads. And then as we opened up into the main part of it, I mean, it was only maybe, as I remember, maybe 10 feet sort of square inside. Some light was coming from above, and what I saw next was just amazing. The biggest salmon and huge eels all swirling around in this pool in front of us. Now, the minute the dinghy broke the water surface there, as we went in, they all shot out. I mean, literally, there was going over sand to get out of that mill race because it was all kind of clogged up with sand as well. It was just amazing. What an adventure. Anyway, we had a paddle around and then you know, just as kids do, we was playing, and then he said, do you want to come and see people catching salmon tomorrow? The poachers are catching salmon on the river tomorrow. Do you want to come and watch them? So I'm like, isn't that illegal? And he was like, yeah, but I can watch them because my dad knows them. So I said, okay. So the next morning, I left my fishing gear behind and I wandered down the river and met this lad. And we walked down near a caravan site, and there were these men stood there with the fishing rods catching salmon. I'm not going to go into the details of how they did it, but it was absolutely amazing to watch. And yeah, so many great memories. So off I went on my walk to Russup after I'd got my pack up, and walking along the river, as I was seeing the river and the campsite opposite where I watched the poachers and everything 50 years ago, it brought back all those memories. And then walking into the village of Russup, I thought, I'm going to go and have a look at the old mill. It's now developed into luxury flats. I mean, no surprise there. But I went and looked at the old, I can't call it a cottage because that would be embellishing it a bit. It wasn't a cottage we stayed in, it was just a row of houses, and there was a doorway on the front of this row of houses, and we were just staying in this 2-bedroomed, well, really small house, which wasn't particularly luxurious in any way, but it was still there. It hadn't really changed from the outside at all. So while the mill had all been developed into luxury flats, this small house was just there, paint peeling off the windows and the door. I think it was like 24A or something like that. That's how insignificant it was. But it was lovely to walk through that village and to see it all again, and it brought back those memories. And then I continued my journey back into the car park and made my way to the hotel. And then the footage that you're seeing on this video that I'm sharing of the sea and the woods and everything, that's the footage from my 8-mile walk along the Cleveland Way and yeah, into the area where I guess it's quite an unspoilt area is Whitby, north of Whitby and around there. If you've never been, it's in Yorkshire in England, and it's where Bram Stoker had the setting for Count Dracula arriving on the boat in the soil in his own coffin. And that's all set, and there's quite a few shops there which are kind of like souvenir shops for Count Dracula and such. But a wonderful place. It holds great memories for me as a child as well, because I remember going there as a child and thinking what a magical fishing town it is. And I do remember actually going off the coast there with my father in a small fishing boat. It was a group I think they call them cobbles, and we'd go out and we'd do fishing for a few hours, and I remember catching fish off that. So great memories. But yeah, that chance meeting with that gentleman again, that really blew my mind. So thank you for watching, and yeah, interesting, isn't it, how those chance meetings or other chance meetings in life really really teach us something, and we see something new. So I'm coming to the end of my journey now. Over 4 hours I've been on the coastal path of the Cleveland Way. I've visited Mulgrove Castle, well, the ruins of Mulgrove Castle, and it's been quite a journey. So I'd just like to thank you for being on this journey with me. It really has been a journey of discovery in many ways, and it's been a lovely way to just come away and be in nature. And you can probably tell by the way I'm talking, I'm quite tired now. My legs are aching, so I'm really looking forward to having a nice soak and relaxing. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch up with you soon.